Hello and welcome to my another video. In today's video, we'll be talking about the airfoil terminologies. Now, before going into depth about what are the different types of terminologies, I want to talk about what airfoil is. So, airfoil is actually a cross section of the aircraft wing. Now, if I draw an airfoil, it looks like this. So, this is how an airfoil looks like from the side. So, now I want to talk about how the aircraft actually lift from the ground. Okay, so what happens actually is that only after the pilot races down the runway we can lift off from the ground. Now how this actually happens is that when the aircraft races down the runway, we have more incoming air coming. We have more incoming air, which we call as a relative airflow. Okay, so after reaching a specific speed down the runway, the pilot applies the elevator. Okay, when the pilot apply the elevator, the angle of the airfoil changes. Okay, angle of the airfoil changes means that in our case we say that the angle of attack changes. Okay, now what the angle of attack I'll talk in the terminology part. So we'll now say that there's a suitable change in angle now after applying the elevator. So now I'll erase this and I'll show about how the airfoil looks like. Now after the pilot apply the elevator, we'll have a suitable angle now. Okay, so now we can see that the airfoil now is at a suitable angle. Okay, now what happens is that more air is flown down the aircraft wing or the airfoil. Okay, so when more airfoil gets deflected downwards, okay, there is in the other direction we have an all as the aerodynamic force. Okay, so this is what aerodynamic force means. Okay, so aerodynamic force can be resolved into into two parts, which is the lift and drag. Okay, now before going into the depth of what lift and drag is, we'll in our video now we'll be focusing on the airfoil terminologies. Now the airfoil, as I showed, is actually like this. Okay, now this is an airfoil. Now there are different terminologies in an airfoil. Okay, so this is what we call as the leading edge, or it's a place or it's a side which have got the maximum curvature. So this is the leading edge, and the end at the end of the airfoil, at the rear end of the airfoil, we have the trailing edge. Now, the straight line joining from the leading edge to the trailing edge, we call it as the chord line. Okay, imaginary straight line joining from the leading edge to the trailing edge, we call as the chord line. Now, there is another line which is at an equidistant place from the upper surface and the lower surface of the airfoil. This is the upper surface. We'll call it as US, and this is the lower surface. Okay, this is the lower surface and the upper surface, which is at an if there's a line which is at an equidistant portion from the upper surface and the lower surface, we call this line as the camber line. Okay, so there are two concepts which we studied now. Okay, the front end of the airfoil we call as a leading edge, the rear side we call as a trailing edge. Straight line joining from the leading edge to the trailing edge, we have the chord line, and the imaginary line which separates the upper surface and the lower surface at equidistant portion, we call as the camber line. We have a positive camber airfoil and a negatively cambered airfoil. Now let's divide this page into two. Now This is a positively cambered. Now what I'm drawing now is a positively cambered airfoil. Now what positively cambered airfoil means, as I said before, the straight line joining from the leading edge to the trailing edge we call as the chord line. Okay, this is the chord line. This is a chord line. Okay, and this is the imaginary line which separates the upper surface and the lower surface, which is a camber line. Now if the camber line is on top of the chord line, okay, if the camber line is on top of the chord line, we call this as a positively cambered airfoil. Like most commercial aircraft which we see, all of the, not most, all of the commercial aircraft which we see is a positively cambered airfoil. Now the negatively cambered airfoil looks like this. Sorry. Now this is how a negatively cambered airfoil looks like. Now the only difference is that now the terminologies are same. Now the chord line lies on top of the camber line. Now that's the only difference. Now say this is the chord line, okay, and this I'll take it as blue color for the camber line. Now this is the camber line. Now if the chord line is on top of the camber line, we call this as a negatively cambered airfoil. Okay, I'm drawing a symmetric airfoil. Okay, a symmetric airfoil looks like this, where we have the chord line, which I said is a line joining from the leading edge to the trailing edge. Okay, otherwise I'll draw inside the airfoil. Okay, now a line joining from inside the leading edge to the trailing edge, okay, is a chord line. Now the camber line also lies at the same place. Now the camber line also lies equal. So if the chord line is equal to the camber line we call as a symmetric airfoil. Now a non-symmetric airfoil looks like this, like the one which we normally draw and one which we normally see in reality is a non-symmetric airfoil, where the camber line, this is a positively cambered line. Okay, now I'll talk about positively and negatively cambered line shortly. Now this is a positively cambered line where we have the chord line and imaginary line separating the upper portion, upper surface and the lower surface. I hope all have got a firmly good idea about the different terminologies of an airfoil. So if you have any doubts regarding the video, do comment in the comment section. Thank you.